יעקב סלע, עד השם צבאות, אשר יד המותח בה, השם הושיע מלך יעננו ביום קוראנו, ליהודים הייתה אורה ושמחה וששון בעיקר, כן תהיה לנו כוס ישועות אשא ובשם השם אקרא.
A good vach, Shavua Tov, a good week to you. My holy sisters and brothers, we're coming out of Shabbos, we're coming back into the world. We always have mixed feelings about that, but I have some really, really beautiful stories to share with you tonight. I'm sorry I'm a little late. I mean, it's not late. This is normal for the amount of time it takes to prepare coming out of Shabbos. But I'm trying to rush it as we get into these summer months so that even though when Shabbos ends late, I'm not going to start so late. Nevertheless, today, the rushing was not really possible. We're having a special event here in our neighborhood. Eitan Katz, whose music you've heard many times during the introduction to the show, is here for a kumzitz, a malava malka tonight, a celebration with music and singing now that we're past those first 3 days of counting the Omer. Live music is permitted. It's actually a fundraiser. It was planned long in advance for Hatzola, wonderful organization that provides EMT services in Jewish communities with special needs, and we support them very much. So actually that kumzitz, that musical event is tonight, and I'm going to try, can't guarantee it, but with God's help, I'm going to go there, and we haven't done this in over a year to go live from a musical event, but I hope to do that this evening, so you may see me come live on again tonight, just a little bit later. Don't be freaked out. There'll be probably very few people wearing masks, but I got to tell you that in our community here, everyone has been vaccinated. They embrace the vaccinations and they've been readily available, and everyone around here is vaxxed. Okay, so let's count the Omer together. We actually did it by the evening service, but I just responded, Amen. I didn't count myself so that I could count with you. Last night we counted 34. I am prepared and ready to fulfill the positive commandment of counting the Omer. As is written in the Torah, you shall count 7 complete weeks from the day following the rest day, meaning the second day of Pesach, when you brought the Omer as a wave offering. To the day after the 7th week, you shall count 50 days. Then you shall present a meal offering of new grain to the Lord. May the pleasantness of the Lord our God be upon us. Establish for us the work of our hands. Establish for us the work of our hands. Blessed are you, Lord our God, King of the universe, who has made us holy through his commandments and has commanded us about counting the Omer. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kidshanu b'mitzvosav v'tzivanu al sefiras ha'omer. Today is the 35th day, making 5 weeks of the Omer. Hayom hamisha shloshim yom shehem hamisha shavuos le'omer. And we meditate on Malchus Shebechod. Hod is this idea of splendor, God's splendor in our lives. When we dedicate ourselves to the service of God and serving our fellow human beings, we acquire a kind of a splendor about ourselves. And then when we meditate on the 7 different aspects of that quality, which is what we've been doing for the last week, the final quality is Malchus, which is kingship, sovereignty, and the idea that when we make God sovereign in our lives, when we submit to God, then that actually becomes a form of service that imbues us with a holy light. And then we say, where is it? I don't usually use this sitter. Master of the universe, you have commanded us through your servant Moses to count the Omer, to cleanse our carapaces and impurities, as you have written in your Torah. You shall count 7 complete weeks from the day following the Pesach rest day when you brought the Omer as a wave offering to the day after the 7th week. You shall count 50 days. This is so that the souls of your people Israel may be purified from their uncleanliness. May it also be your will, Lord our God and God of our ancestors, that in the merit of the Omer count that I have counted today, there may be rectified any defect on my part in the counting of Malchus Shebechod, the sovereignty of the quality of splendor. May I be cleansed and sanctified with your holiness on high, and through this may there flow a rich stream through all the worlds to rectify our lives, spirits, and souls from any dross or defect, purifying and sanctify us with your sublime holiness. And we say, Amen. That was counting the Omer tonight for the end of the 5th week at 35 days where we are. Who's with us tonight as we read some beautiful, I'm going to share some spectacular stories with you. And then a very interesting passage from the Talmud. Shavua Tov says, Sharon Frant-Brooks in New Jersey, burning the midnight oil. Bill in Berkeley, Melissa in Great Neck, Paula in the Northeast, Gwen in Michigan, Lucy in Minnesota, Harold and Loretta in Oregon, DK in Georgia. Keith in South Africa. Welcome, Keith. Good to see you. Belle in Illinois. Dorothy in Pittsburgh, Lori in Kentucky. I guess you guys had a fast day. I mean, the Kentucky Derby was run in Kentucky today. Welcome, everybody. So I heard two and a half spectacular stories on this Shabbos, and I just wanted to share. One I heard from Nina. She's going to be making a presentation soon, I think a multiple-part presentation on the teachings of the Chafetz Chaim. An incredible light in the history of the sages of the Jewish people who lived, I think he was sort of late 1800s, early 1900s, lived to a very ripe old age. And there's some beautiful teachings about him. This one story, he shared many incredible teachings, but he was also like somebody in person who touched many lives. And in this one story, there was a boy who was just a little bit troubled and it didn't quite fit in at the Jewish school that he was attending. This was an Orthodox school. And they caught this boy smoking a cigarette on Shabbos, right? So, I mean, he violated Shabbos in a major way. You can't kindle a fire on Shabbos. You don't smoke on Shabbos. And because the parents and the teachers were afraid that this boy would be a bad influence on the other kids since he had such a disrespect for Shabbos, they said they were going to have to dismiss him from the school, expel him from the school. And I believe that in the locale where he was, there wasn't going to be another Jewish school that he could go to. So expelling him from that school was going to be essentially, dismissing him from the tradition. It was, likely result of that would be that he would end up, off the derech, outside the path of Judaism. The word came to the Chafetz Chaim that they were, this was happening, this was in process, and he said, "Let me speak to the boy before you do anything so drastic as to throw him out of that school." So the boy had a meeting with the Chafetz Chaim, and no one knows what went on in that meeting. But he came out of that meeting. It was not a very long meeting, but he came out of that meeting. And he was changed. And he not only took Shabbos seriously, he took his studies seriously, he took a life of Torah seriously. In fact, nobody was more dedicated than him in the school. And so this idea of never giving up on a student you don't know, what could happen, what the potential of young people is the reason that story was often shared. And one time, a rabbi, a speaker, was giving over that story in front of an audience many years later, many years after it happened. And, people appreciated the story, and then the audience started to empty out. And there was one older man, I think at that time in his 60s or 70s, who just stayed behind and was visibly agitated. And the speaker noticed him and sort of came over. And this old man said to the speaker, I want to tell you that the boy in that story was me. And now I'd like to share with you what happened from my perspective. Of course, the speaker was fascinated. The man said, the first part of the story is entirely accurate. I wasn't really into my studies. I wasn't into, the system of Judaism as it was presented to me. I did smoke a cigarette. It was an act of rebellion. And they brought me, and I thought I was out. Really, I figured when I lit that cigarette that they would kick me out. I went, but they asked me to see the Chofetz Chaim. That's the last thing I wanted to do. I figured, this respected, super prominent sage would just make me feel guilty. But they urged me to go see him because he had asked to see me. So, okay, I went in expecting a long lecture. There was no lecture. The Chofetz Chaim, at this time a very old man, took the boy's hands in his hands, didn't say anything, but became very emotional and started crying and looking this boy in the eyes with tears falling out of his own eyes. The Chofetz Chaim only said, Shabbos, 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 Shabbos. He didn't tell the boy that Shabbos is important. He showed the boy how important Shabbos is to him, to the Jewish people, and to our Creator who made us. What a lesson in teaching. To share with somebody something that's important to you by showing them how important it is to you. But obviously, it's so much more powerful than just telling them that it's important. Showing them with your emotion, opening your heart. That boy was so touched by this old and respected rabbi's, complete vulnerability and showing him. It changed his life. Put him back on the path. He ended up becoming an influential person himself who assisted many others in their studies. What a beautiful story. The other thing I wanted to share, I just heard a few minutes ago by our evening. We had a beautiful third meal of Shabbos with singing. And my Rav, Yekusel Kalmanson's brother-in-law, Rabbi Shochet, who's a Chabad rabbi, shared this story. Also, about the importance of learning, and you never know. He told several stories. I'm not going to give over this whole thing, but there's just this one part because you and I study Talmud together, and I just wanted to share this. So one of the great rabbis of the mid 20th century was Rabbi Moshe Feinstein. I mean, he was just considered the posek, right? If you had a question of halacha, of Jewish law, Moshe Feinstein, his answer was definitive, authoritative, and definitive. So there's just two little episodes about Moshe Feinstein. One was he once called his nephew and said, "Come on over, let's make a l'chaim." And the nephew said, "Why? What are we making a l'chaim on?" And he said, "I've just completed Shas," meaning he just finished the whole journey. Like we're doing Daf Yomi, it's going to take us 7.5 years because we read one page a day. Rabbi Moshe Feinstein absorbed Talmud at a much faster rate than that, and he went through the entire Talmud many times. And so his nephew quipped, if we make a l'chaim, if we have a drink to celebrate every time you finish Shas, we're going to be alcoholics. You finish Shas so often. And Moshe Feinstein said, no, I'm actually, it's for the first time. For the first time? What do you mean? You've completed Shas many times. He says, yeah, well, I've completed it 101 times. So this is my first time in the second 100. Or my first time after having done it 100 times. So that's how familiarized Moshe Feinstein was with the Talmud and how seriously he took his own studies. Then there was another time that he was called to answer a question. The question came from a family which was like this. There was a secular Jewish family. They were not, Torah observant Jews at all. The teenage boy was very into sports, but somehow he took it. This was a long time ago. They didn't have birthright, but he got himself somehow on a trip to Israel. I think it might have even been in a sports context. It might have even been having to do with the Maccabee Games, which I competed in. A beautiful, beautiful gathering of Jewish athletes from around the world. And while he was in Israel, he felt moved by the holiness of Israel. And he started to learn with various rabbis there, eventually got into a yeshiva, and spent a couple of years learning in the yeshiva in Israel, and ended up applying, the way he really devoted himself to sports, he then devoted himself to Torah, and particularly to Talmud. And was just learning, 8, 10, 12 hours a day. I mean, really trying to catch up a little bit. I mean, at least he started when he was a teenager, not like me when I was in my 30s, but he was determined to catch up as fast as he possibly could. And really his whole life changed. He came back home, and his father said to him, well, what were you learning over there that was so important to you? And the boy said, yeah, we learned Torah, we learned Talmud. And the father says, well, teach me some Talmud. I would like to learn some Talmud. And the boy started to put him off because he knew that his father couldn't even read Hebrew, had no background at all, just like he had been. At least he had gone to Hebrew school. The father hadn't even gone to Hebrew school. To start to teach his father Talmud the way he had been learning it in Hebrew and Aramaic, in this intensive 2 years that he'd spent, it just wasn't going to be possible. But the father kept pushing him, and finally said, all right, well, okay, Dad, let's start. So I don't even know what tractate it was, but they got onto the first page of one of the tractates. Traditionally, learning starts with Bava Metzia. Sort of in traditional learning, a cloak is found with two people claiming it's theirs. Maybe they started there, I'm not sure. But at any rate, they started to go through this page, but the son, they couldn't get more than a few words without the son saying, okay, well, the reason that, first of all, what this word means, and this is how the alphabet works, and there's a system of thought, and you have rabbis who said this and who said that. And I mean, they were just moving just a few words a day. It took them a year to finish the first page, moving at this pace. Obviously, the son was able to give over a lot. They were going at a level of depth where maybe they weren't advancing so many words on the page, but he was communicating to the father all kinds of ideas of learning and Talmud learning. So when they finally finished that page after a year, the father said, so I understand that you can make a celebration when you complete something. It's called a siyum, right? He had been learning a little bit too. And the son said, well, Dad, I mean, maybe you can make a siyum on a chapter. Normally, we only make a siyum when we finish a whole tractate, and then a big siyum when we finish the entire Talmud, right? All of it's called a shas, as it's called. We've only finished a page. And the father said, well, but we finished a page. We spent a year on this, and we finally made it to the end of the page. I want to make a celebration. So this is how the question ended up coming before Moshe Feinstein. Can you make a siyum celebration when you complete one page of study? And Rabbi Moshe Feinstein said, not only can you make a siyum, I am coming to your siyum to celebrate with you and make a l'chaim. And they had a great celebration, and, perhaps the father had some kind of premonition, because a very short time after that siyum, the father, died very unexpectedly and left this world. And the son would be forever moved, and that whole community would be forever moved by this father's excitement, in his one page of learning, and that so late in life he had finally come to Torah and to Talmud thanks to his son, and that excitement and sharing between the generations, and that opportunity for a father and son to learn. Doesn't matter who's teaching who, but the father and son, parent and child learning together was such a big deal. I was so moved by this story. So everything that we study together, what an opportunity that we have to learn together now. We are on page 20 of Tractate Yoma, the 6th volume of the Talmud. These are the laws of Passover, of Yom Kippur. We are in chapter 1. We've generally been studying about the sequestering of the high priest during the 7 days before Yom Kippur as he is prepared. He's kept away from impurity. He's spiritually preparing himself for his encounter with the divine presence in the Holy of Holies. He's trained in all the avoda, all of the rituals that ordinary priests do on other days, but he will have to do everything, bring the daily offering as well as the special offerings of Yom Kippur, have several washings and immersions and all this kind of stuff, and all the laws is what he's been learning throughout this chapter. To now, we are studying the 6th Mishnah of chapter 1. But actually, before we get to the 6th Mishnah, just a couple of beautiful little verses or teachings at the end of the discussion of the 5th Mishnah. So the Gemara relates that the idea was that on the night of Yom Kippur, they would keep him up all night. They would keep the high priest up all night. They used various stratagems to keep him up that night so that he would not fall asleep. And the prominent men of Jerusalem would not sleep the entire night, but instead engaged in Torah studies so that the high priest would hear the sound of noise in the city, right? So not only were they, agents of the court and his fellow priests, there's only one high priest, but the other priests on the Temple Mount, they were engaged with him. They were making him walk on the cold floor. They were singing before him. They were teaching Torah. They were having him teach them Torah. All that was going on the Temple Mount. But to sort of, show solidarity and show the high priest that all of the city is also up with you on the night of Yom Kippur, they would hear the noise of people learning Torah, out loud, right? Like with loud voices throughout the city. And sleep would not overcome him in the silence of a sleeping city. And it was taught in a baraisa that Abba Shaul said, they would do so even in the outlying areas and stay awake all night in acknowledgement of the temple. However, this led to an unexpected result. The result was that they would sin as the men and women would participate in games together to pass the time, leading to transgression. You can see how sort of customs can mutate over time. Initially, people were staying up all night, first in Jerusalem and then in the outlying areas to sort of show solidarity with the high priest who has to stay up all night. And so they were studying Torah all night. But then over the course of time, it just became a thing to stay up all night. And then since it was a challenge to stay up all night and they're fasting because it's Yom Kippur, so then they came up with games to sort of help, stay awake. And then that led to men and women intermingling. And the intermingling of men and women eventually led to sin. Abaye said, and some say it was Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak who said, interpret the statement as referring to Nehardea. This is not in the land of Israel, but rather in the Jewish community in Babylonia. As Elijah the prophet said to Rav Yehuda, the brother of Rav Salah Hasidah, you have said and wondered, why has the Messiah not come? I mean, this is them asking 2,000 years ago, why has Mashiach not come? Here we're asking the same question 2,000 years later. But then they said, why has the Mashiach not come? Why is that surprising? Isn't today Yom Kippur? And relations were had with several unmarried women in Nehardea. And as the men and women stayed awake all night, that led to promiscuity. And Rav Yehuda said to him, what did the Holy One, blessed be He, say about those sins committed by the Jewish people? He said, this is what God said. Sin lies waiting at the door. That's Genesis 4:7. You'll recall this was in the episode of Cain and Abel, right? When Cain was thinking about killing his brother, or maybe even after he killed his brother and before it was known, and God is questioning him. And he says, am I my brother's keeper, right? And then somewhere in that conversation, God says, sin will always be crouching at the door. The temptation to do what you want instead of what's right will always be crouching at the door. But you can, what? Oh, you scared me. But you can overcome it. Sorry, I didn't light up the candle. Let's light up the darkness. Thank you for the reminder. Okay. Sin lies waiting at the door, and it is no wonder that the men sin, right? If people have been tempted by sin at all times, it's not such a surprise that when eventually people succumb to sin. And he asked him, and what did Satan, the prosecutor, say about their sinning? Okay, in other words, somebody was saying, well, look, okay, the people fell, but how much can you blame them? They're human. Humans make mistakes. And God even said, you're going to make mistakes. Sin is always crouching at the door. And what did Satan, the prosecutor, say about their sinning? Remember, Satan is an angel whose job it is to be the accuser and to point out the faults of the humans to God. And Elijah said to him, Satan on Yom Kippur has no license to prosecute. Right? So Satan, the prosecuting angel, can go around accusing the humans of all our faults and point them out to God, bring them to God's attention. And, when it's brought to God's attention, so he sort of has to deal with us. And so like Satan is this big tattletale, pointing out all the faults of the humans. But on Yom Kippur, Satan has no power, right? Because we're so busy on Yom Kippur atoning for our sins, we get it. We know we've done wrong. We know we've slipped. We know that we're human and we've fallen prey to our urges. And we're admonishing ourselves. We don't need Satan to do that. And so Satan is powerless on the day of Yom Kippur. And from where is that idea derived? Rami Bar Chama said the numerological value, so the gematria, right? Every Hebrew letter also has a numerical value. The numerological value of the letters that constitute the word ha-satan is 364. He has a value of 5, sin has a value of 300, tet has a value of 9, and nun has a value of 50. So 364 days of the solar year, which is 365 days long, Satan has a license to prosecute. But on the remaining day, Yom Kippur, he has no license to prosecute. Since that day is exalted above all others, there is no room for the accusations of Satan. That concludes the discussion of the 5th Mishnah in chapter 1. Here's Mishnah number 6. Every day, the priests would remove the ashes from the altar and place them on the east side of the ramp at the crow of the rooster or adjacent to it, whether before it or after it, as there was no insistence on a precise time. And on Yom Kippur, they would remove the ashes earlier, from midnight onward. And on the festivals, the ashes were removed even earlier, at the end of the first watch. And the call of the rooster would not arrive on festivals until the temple courtyard was already filled with Jewish people who vowed to bring offerings and would fulfill their obligations on the festivals. Those offerings were sacrificed immediately following the daily offering. Right? So the simple teaching here is that the altar where the offerings are brought in the Holy Temple, it would burn all night, and there would be a lot of ashes to remove in the morning to prepare for the new day's offerings. So on a normal day of the year, they would sweep out the altar at about sunrise when the rooster crows. On Yom Kippur, they would sweep it out earlier so that everything would be prepared for the high priest. He has so much to do, he shouldn't have to have any kind of interference from other things like cleaning the altar. That was not something he had to do himself. And on festivals, they would clean it out very early, like at around midnight or something, because so many people were coming to bring their festival offerings, and they would be in the courtyard getting ready for that. And they had to be prepared to start, instantly at daylight, and everything had to be cleaned out. It took a lot more preparation to get ready for festivals. That's the Mishnah. I'm skipping down a little bit to the B side of page 20. The term Kiryat HaGever, translated above as Kiryas HaGever, translated above as the call of the rooster, is mentioned in the Mishna as an indication of a certain time. And the Gemara asks, what is the meaning of the phrase Kiryas HaGever? Rav said it is the call of the man. The priest appointed for this task proclaimed that it was time for the priest to report for service. Rabbi Sheila said it is the call of the rooster, which is also called gever. So this word gever can either mean a man, a person, or a rooster, right? So when was, the first duties of the day, of the daylight day, done in the temple? Was it at the call of a rooster or at the call of a crier, meaning somebody who would actually shout from the tallest part of the temple and sort of wake up everybody? Was it a man or was it a rooster that would trigger the start of the solar day in the temple? Rav happened to come to the place where Rabbi Sheila, hold on one second, I just want to check something. We're Rabbi Sheila. So Rav happened to come to the place where Rabbi Sheila was the most prominent local Torah scholar, and Rav, who was already famous throughout the land as the most prominent Torah scholar in the Babylonian Jewish community, was not known by his face in that particular locale, right? Where Rabbi Sheila was the sort of bigwig in that area. Rav, they'd heard of Rav, but they'd never seen Rav. So when Rav showed up, they didn't recognize him. And there was no amora to stand before Rabbi Sheila. Amora. What is an amora? So you've heard me use this word many times. A Tana is a rabbi of the Mishnaic period, right? The first 200 years of the Common Era. And an amora is the rabbi of the Gemara, those next 300 years, from about the year 200 of the Common Era to about the year 500 of the Common Era. Those are the rabbis of the Talmud, and they are commenting on the teachings of the rabbis of the Mishna. Each one is called an amora, or plural, amoraim. But what is an amora? What does that word actually mean? Right, it's related to amor. We just had the parsha amor, which means speaking, right? It's about the power of speech. And amora, we would translate as a disseminator, meaning they didn't have PA systems, they didn't have microphones, they didn't have speakers. So when a great sage would come and give a lecture and have a big audience gathered around him, it was considered undignified for him to have to step up and shout so that everybody could hear him. And not every sage had that kind of a powerful speaking voice. There were sages whose minds were, incredible jewels of the Jewish people, but who did not have the voice to be heard, by 1,000 people in a time when there was no amplification. So what did they do? They relied on disseminators, who were learned people. They were, rabbis in themselves, but who could just hear what the sage said and repeat it in a really loud voice so that everybody present could hear it. So where Rabbi Sheila was teaching that day, there was no disseminator. There was no amora. Rav happened to be there. They didn't know that he was the great sage Rav. Since there was no disseminator, Rav stepped up. He stood before him to disseminate the lecture, in the course of which Rabbi Sheila mentioned Kriyas HaGever, this idea that they would clean the ashes in the morning when there was the call of what? Either the rooster or the man. Now, often what would happen with the disseminators, he was also translating, because the sage would speak in Hebrew, and then the disseminator would translate into Aramaic, right, which was the lingua franca, the common language of the area. Whereas like today, it would be like if somebody from Israel came in and was teaching in Hebrew and somebody was, instantaneously translating into English for us. So Rabbi Sheila mentioned the call of Hagever, and Rav interpreted the concept for the audience, and he said, what is the meaning of Kriyas Hagever? It means the call of the man. And Rabbi Sheila said to him, and let the master say it is the call of the rooster. That's how Rabbi Sheila understood it, that it was the call of the rooster. Rav said to him, quoting a folk saying, A flute played for noblemen is music, but when it's played for weavers, they receive no pleasure from it due to their lack of sophistication. So Rav used a common saying from that place. I think a similar saying in English would be pearls before swine, right? He certainly wouldn't have said that. But this idea that he introduced a beautiful and subtle and important teaching that Kriyas HaGever is actually talking about the call of the crier in the temple, a priest who's specially appointed to that task, not a rooster, but the one who is teaching the lecture didn't get it. I imagine that Rav said that privately. He would not have embarrassed Rabbi Sheila. When I stood, so when is when I stood? Who is talking now? I don't know. Oh, it must be, oh, I'm sorry, Rav is still talking. So Rav says, when I stood before Rabbi Sheila and interpreted what is the meaning of Kriyas HaGever, it means the call, and I said it means the call of the man. He did not say anything to me in response. And Rabbi Sheila was considered a very great and important sage, sort of much more prominent than Rabbi Sheila. And he did not say anything to me in response. And you, Rabbi Sheila, say to me, no, you should translate it as the call of the rooster. As soon as Rabbi Sheila heard that, he knew at once who had been disseminating his lecture. He knew that Rav was a student, I guess, of Rabbi Sheila. And now he realized that this man who came here and the way he was teaching and the way he was presenting himself, that this is the great sage Rav. And he said to him, is the master Rav? Meaning, are you the master before me? Are you Rav? If that is so, then let the master rest and cease disseminating my lecture, as it is beneath your dignity to serve as my assistant. Rav said to him, people also say this aphorism, if you hired yourself to him, comb his wool. Right? So if you took a job as somebody's assistant or somebody's employee, then whatever he needs you to do, you do it. Right? Combing the wool of a sheep was considered an unpleasant task. But if you're the man's assistant and he needs a sheep combed, so you comb the sheep, right? I've hired myself out to you to be your disseminator. You might not agree with my interpretation, but I am prepared to finish the job. It doesn't matter that I may be considered prominent elsewhere. Today, I'm your amora. I'm your disseminator. Once one agrees to perform a task, he should bear its less pleasing aspects and complete the job. Some say, this is what Rav said to him, one elevates to a higher level in matters of sanctity and one does not downgrade. We talked about this before. In matters of holiness, we only promote, we only upgrade, we don't degrade. And so, since Rav had begun as the amora, as the disseminator for Rabbi Sheila, if they took him out and brought somebody else in, who's a, sort of the more typical stature of rabbi, to be somebody else's disseminator, well then, in terms of the crowd, first they had Rav as their disseminator, and then it would go down in a level to whoever else was going to replace him. And we don't downgrade in matters of holiness, so we got to leave Rav in on the job. And that's what I've got for us this evening. Let me see if there's any comments or questions. Okay. Hold on one second. This needs to reload. What a great question. Tom Beck says, does Satan get in trouble for Lashon Hara, even though it's his job? Right? In other words, Satan's job is to do exactly that which we've learned we're not supposed to do. We shouldn't be speaking ill of other people. We shouldn't be criticizing them. We shouldn't be talking about them. We certainly shouldn't be pointing out their faults to other people. But Satan, that seems to be his job. So presumably, since God gave him that job, he's allowed to speak Lashon Hara. But I'll tell you, it's a thankless job. Right? It's a thankless job. And it's, it's almost like that song, Sympathy for the Devil. Right? I mean, Satan is not the devil, right? Those are the views of another religion. Satan is not a devil. Satan just has a difficult job to do. Sharon says, an amora sounds like the character from Saturday Night Live that Garrett Morris played, interpreter for the hard of hearing. right? Where he would just shout out what had just been said for him. Exactly. That's basically the idea. Okay, my friends, that's what I've got for us tonight. It's a beautiful way to start a new week. We've heard some beautiful stories about the Chofetz Chaim and about Rabbi Moshe Feinstein. And now I'm going to go to this music event and I'll see if I can get a good signal, if I can get an angle, if I can share with you some of that music. No guarantees, but I'm hoping that I'll be able to go live momentarily from this Kumsitz with Eitan Katz. If not, then with God's help, I'll see you tomorrow at the regular time, 6 p.m. Pacific, when we continue our journey through Tractate Yoma. Have a beautiful night and a great week.